Hi, everyone, and welcome to the session today. We're really delighted to have an excellent panel pulled together for this discussion. I am your moderator for this session, Sarah Keys. I'm the Chief Executive Officer at Issb Global Advisors based in Toronto. And today we have an esteemed panel who's really going to help us dive into preparing boardrooms for new climate-related disclosure rules. And we'll get both a US and Canadian perspective. So it's my pleasure now to introduce your panelists. I'm going to start by introducing Joanne Mateer. Joanne is a special advisor to the executive on sustainable finance and emerging regulatory issues at the Ontario Securities Commission. Welcome, Joanne. Next, we have Marianne Bushkins. She's an MBA, a JD in law, and has the ICD.D designation, and she's a corporate director on Algoma Steel's board of directors. And last but certainly not least, we have Stephen Rothstein. He's the managing director of the Series Accelerator for Sustainable Capital Markets. And Catherine DeLacy, unfortunately, due to a last-minute emergency, is unable to join us today. She sends her sincere regrets, and we wish her all the best. So with that, we're going to dive right into the discussion. We have 1 hour here in front of us, and ultimately that's not a lot of time to dig into a variety of different issues that I know each of our panelists will want to explore. And I wanted to acknowledge right up front that one of our panelists, Joanne Mateer, has to leave us about halfway through today's session at around 10:30 a.m. Eastern. So I'll make sure to ask Joanne some questions up front as part of this discussion so we can get her perspective prior to her departure. So before we dive into this complex topic of Canadian and US climate disclosure rules, I wanted to highlight just a few developments that we've seen with respect to the proposals that have been tabled by the Securities Exchange Commission in the United States and the Canadian Securities Administrators here in Canada. Both securities regulators have tabled new mandatory climate change disclosure proposals, and consultation periods were undertaken for both sets of draft rules. What we see is a real divergence as well as areas of similarity for these rules. And to set the stage for this conversation, I wanted to highlight a few key elements of these proposals. Of course, you can go and read them in full detail for yourself, so we won't spend too much time hashing out the various elements of these proposals. We're really going to focus our panel discussion on the so what for corporate directors, helping you to think about some of the practical tips and tools you can use to get started in your oversight of enhanced disclosure to meet these new regulatory requirements. So when we look at the SEC and CSA's new proposals, we can see a heavy emphasis on alignment with the recommendations of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, or the Tcfd. And ultimately, this has become the gold standard for financial reporting on the impacts of climate risks and opportunities on an organization's financial prospects, operations, and ultimately long-term value creation. And both proposals have outlined details with respect to the measurement and reporting of greenhouse gas emissions, although in varying scopes. The SEC's draft proposal has suggested Scope 1 and 2 greenhouse gas emissions will be mandatory for disclosure, and Scope 3 emissions being dependent on whether or not it is deemed financially material. We also see the use of internal carbon pricing and emissions offsets as dependent disclosure requirements in the SEC proposal, whereas in contrast, the CSA is silent on these two topics. When it comes to greenhouse gas emissions, the CSA has used a comply or explain approach. In the next set of criteria that we look at, we're thinking about disclosure related to climate change scenario analysis, greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets, company transition plans, climate risk exposure, and the impacts of climate risk and opportunity on business strategy. Here again, we see this SEC proposal having a series of mandatory and dependent disclosure related to these topics, whereas the CSA has been silent on the topic of scenario analysis and transition plans. In both cases, the SEC and the CSA have suggested that it should be mandatory for companies to explain their climate risk exposure and the impacts of climate change on their business strategy where they have been assessed as financially material. The last category I wanted to highlight between these two proposals is related to the impacts on your financial statements. The SEC's proposal has a significant amount of mandatory disclosure proposed in this area, including defining clear time horizons for short, medium, and long-term impacts, a clear articulation of both management oversight and board oversight of climate change, and definition of financial statement impacts greater than 1% related to climate change risks and opportunities and associated financial statement assumptions. When we compare to the CSA, while the requirement for management and board oversight of climate remains mandatory, we see that the definitions of time horizons and financial statement impacts and assumptions are silent or not required. So ultimately what we see is some convergence around the TCFD framework, with the SEC's proposal being far more detailed and technical in contrast to the CSA's, which offers more of a flexible guidance approach. So with that landscape, we also know we have panelists here today who have been actively involved, not only in reviewing the consultation feedback and crafting these proposals, but also engaging with those who will ultimately be responsible for fulfilling these disclosure obligations. So I'd like to offer our panelists a starting point around what is one key takeaway for our audience of corporate directors to know in relation to these climate change disclosure proposals. And I'm going to start with Joanne. I'll go to Stephen, and then we'll finish off with Marianne. Joanne, please.
Great. Well, thank you, Sarah. And thank you, everyone, for having me here today on this panel. I'm excited to talk to you about our climate-related initiative. Before I get too far, I should note that any comments I make today represent my own views and not necessarily the views of the Canadian Securities Administrators, the OSC, or their respective staff. So in terms of one key takeaway for corporate directors, as a starting point, it is important to remember that these proposals are not yet finalized. We have considered the feedback on our proposal and are also doing a deep dive on international developments, including looking at the Canadian stakeholder feedback on the International Sustainability Standards Board proposal, as well as the SEC's proposal. This assessment is intended to inform a CSA rule that serves the needs of Canadian capital markets, has considered international consensus, responds to Canadian investor needs, and also reflects the realities for Canadian companies. This is very much an evolving area. That being said, a key takeaway for directors today is that climate-related risk should be on their radar. They need to know the risk that climate change poses to their company, and if material, how that risk is being managed. There isn't a one-size-fits-all approach to how a board should address climate risk. And as we know, climate change can impact companies in different ways, including companies in the same sector. But boards should at least consider the issue and its materiality to the business. There are a lot of steps that directors can take from a governance perspective. They may wish to think about who should be responsible for oversight of material climate-related risks and opportunities, for example, the board as a whole or a committee. They should look at the skills and competencies of the board and consider whether they have sufficient expertise to assess the material risks facing the company. And where they don't, think of ways to build that expertise, such as through training, retaining an external expert, or getting detailed briefings on the relevant issues from management. They may want to make room on the board agenda for regular reports on material climate-related risks. And a board may want to understand how climate risk is being managed and incorporated into the company's business strategy, and whether there are adequate resources to address the risk. While boards wait for the adoption of climate-related disclosure requirements, they can use this intermediate period to set up their governance and risk management structures to address material climate-related risks and position themselves well to meet their investors' evolving information needs.
Great. Again, I'll follow up. First, as I agree with everything that was just said, if I had to summarize what investors should do, it'd be in 2 words: get ready. Because we know there will be new rules put in place, Canada, US, Issb, and others. We don't know all the details yet, but we have a general framework. And 92% of Fortune 500 companies today have some kind of environmental disclosure. So there are different degrees, different level of detail. So, questions for the board is there currently a board structure to address this? Are there committees? Again, there's a whole conversation about what kind of committees and things like that. Does the board receive general reports on climate-related risks and opportunities? again, we talk about a lot about the risks, and there are enormous risks, but there are enormous opportunities. I hope we'll have time to spend time on that as well. Is it built into executive compensation? There's no one model for everybody, but there are a variety of things. Is there a cross-cutting committee within the company looking at these kinds of issues? Because this is not an issue that one person can deal with. It's not just in marketing or in legal, but it affects HR and purchasing and expansion and finance and all other areas. So depending where the company is in their journey of getting ready, I would, look at the rules, whether it be the SEC or the Canadian rules, and say, if those were put in place today, what systems do we need to have to strengthen those? How is the board itself getting educated? Are they taking classes? Are they reading material to get up the learning curve? So there's a lot that many boards are doing now. We're working with some boards on this issue, but there's a lot more that can be done. With that, I'll turn that over to Mary Ann.
Thanks. It's funny when you come in third here, it's everything that you said, totally agree with. I mean, I think, when we look at this today, we have to say that climate change is now widely recognized as a financial and systemic risk, as well as a factor that is integral to value creation in companies. And so these new climate disclosure proposals do fall directly within directors' duties and obligations, which means in my estimation that directors need to become conversant in this. They need to be educated in order to fulfill their duties to the corporation, and also in order to be able to provide adequate oversight to the management team. I sort of come at this as a former CEO who is now on the board of a company. And so there's always the idea, noses in, fingers out for board. But when you think about something as critical as climate change and taking a company that is going to need to comply and bringing it from where it may be today in terms of having a risk register to all the way through to providing an ESG report and then ultimately complying with the new financial reporting obligations, this takes a lot of people to do. It's not just costly, but management who definitely do need to take the lead on this are going to need a lot of board oversight and involvement and encouragement, I think, in terms of we're good spending the money to bring in experts, because we need to do this right foundationally from the bottom up so that we build something that is able to adapt to new and changing rules.
Excellent. And thank you so much for all of these kind of opening remarks. And what we really want to dig into in this respect is for corporate directors, we've heard it's coming, get ready, and it's really important to understand your role. And so I'm going to turn to Joanne next, recognizing she's got the least amount of time with us this morning. And I'd like to understand from your perspective, Joanne, reporting is just the output. This is often something that we say. And so what does this actually mean from a practical perspective in terms of integration of climate risk and opportunity into board oversight of strategy and strategic planning and ultimately risk management?
Sure, thank you. I think before getting into that, it's helpful to take a step back and look at why we put forward the proposed rule for climate-related disclosures. So as Sarah mentioned at the start, in October 2021, the CSA published for comment a proposed rule setting out requirements for climate-related disclosures. By generally following the TCFD recommendations, the proposed rule would require a comprehensive discussion of how climate change is being thought of and managed within a company. Investors need this information in order to price risk, allocate their capital efficiently, and manage their portfolios. And we have heard from some investors, particularly institutional investors, that there are concerns with the current state of climate-related disclosures in Canada. These include that disclosures may not be complete, consistent, or comparable, and quantitative information is often limited. Companies may also cherry pick by reporting selectively against a particular voluntary standard or framework. And sustainability reporting can be siloed and is not necessarily integrated into companies' financial reporting structures and subject to the same rigor. Our review of climate-related disclosures in 2021 similarly noted some concerns. While 92% of the companies in the review sample disclosed climate-related risks in their regulatory filings, on average, only 59% of the risks were relevant, detailed, and entity-specific. The remaining risks were boilerplate, vague, or incomplete. As a result, there is a need for improvement, and that is where we come in as a securities regulator. Our role as a securities regulator is about bringing consistent, comparable, and decision-useful information to investors. So that is the why. And looking at what the role of directors is, the board has a key role in all the areas that Sarah mentioned, in strategic planning, risk oversight, and regulatory disclosures. So for example, the board should adopt a strategic planning process and approve a strategic plan which considers, among other things, the opportunities and risks of the business. The board's mandate should include responsibility for identifying the principal risks facing the business and having a system in place to manage these risks. And the board must approve the company's annual and interim regulatory filings or delegate the approval of the interim filings to its audit committee. There are some uncertainties around the timing and impacts of climate change, but boards should still take steps to understand and assess the materiality of these risks to their business. They should assess their expertise with respect to sector-specific climate-related risks. This will enable them to ask the right questions of management and make informed decisions about both risk management as well as public disclosure. We published guidance in 2019 regarding disclosure of climate-related risks. It is set out in CSA Staff Notice 51358. Our guidance is intended to provide practical support to both boards and management. One of the ways we did this is by providing select questions for them to consider. For example, questions for the board include, does the board have the information to understand sector-specific climate-related risks? Does the board have enough information to oversee and considers management's assessment of these risks, including their materiality to the business? Is the board aware of how their investors are factoring climate-related risks into their investment and voting decisions? Is oversight and management of these risks and opportunities integrated into the company's strategic plan? The key message in our guidance for directors is that they should be turning their mind to climate change if they have not already done so, and really understand how this is or will impact their business and what their strategy will be. The impacts of climate change can potentially be far-reaching. Boards and management need to understand and consider these risks so that they can make informed decisions, including about what disclosures are made.
Thanks, Joanne. It's a fantastic overview just in terms of some of the background work that went into the CSA ultimately publishing that new proposed mandatory climate disclosure rules. This is a topic that has been both studied and evaluated by the Canadian Securities Regulators for quite some time. And in that regard, I want to make sure I have a lot of questions for our panelists. I want to make sure that all of you are using the Q&A function to ask your questions. And I'm going to check in and take a look at these questions as we go along, and don't hold back until the end. So please do feel free to use the Q&A function as well. And Joanne, whenever you need to drop off with us, please feel free to do so, and we really appreciate your comments. I'm going to switch gears to Stephen now. We know that much has been made of these new disclosure proposals, and certainly we've seen even a politicization around some of this conversation within the business community, particularly in the US. Curious to hear, from your perspective, what has been the market reaction, both from an issuer and an investor perspective, to these new proposed rules?
First is enormous amount of interest. This started in the first quarter of 21, where the then chair issued a notice of inquiry saying, should the SEC issue draft rules with a set of questions? They got hundreds of responses, overwhelmingly supportive. The draft rules were issued in March with a comment period ending in June. They received over 14,000 comments, very large number for the SEC overall. 80% have been very positive. But it's very strong opinions on both sides. Investors are overwhelmingly supportive. So we did an analysis. There are roughly, I think it's 320 investor letters. And I will send out in a minute, a link to a blog we just wrote about this. But basically 90% of investors are very supportive. If you go point by point, should it include scope 1, scope 2? Should it include scope 3? Should it be in the filing in the 10K? It's attestation, go down one point after another. There's an overwhelming support for these issues. So investors are overwhelmingly supporting. Companies and trade groups, they vary. There are some who feel they don't want the government to regulate anything else, no matter what the topic is. They don't want more government regulation. Others feel this particular proposed rule went too far, either on scope 3 or on the amount of detail that was required in what's called in the US, the SX is a 1% rule, which I'm happy to explain if we want to get into the level of detail. So I think it's fair to say that investors are overwhelmingly on one side supporting, and they've been doing this for years. In fact, we, Ceres and investors, had the first meeting with the SEC in 2003, 20 years ago, asking for more disclosure. Investors are not just asking for the SEC in letters signed to the G20, they're clear about it, in setting their own net zero. In the last 3 years, investors representing about $60 trillion of assets, 61 trillion to be, have committed to be net zero by 2050, and about half of them have made commitments for 2030, where they'll be along that process. So the investors are taking it seriously. But this is a big change. Things are doing. It's not the first time that the SEC has addressed climate. In fact, in 1971, so 50 years ago, during the Nixon administration, was the first time the SEC mentioned, it wasn't called climate then, it was called environment, but then they had rules that dealt with asbestos issues and others. So they have been addressing this, and then in 2010, issued a climate disclosure guideline. So they've been doing this work for a while, but as you say, unfortunately in the US, more than many other countries, this issue of climate is very politicized on both sides.
Thank you, Stephen. I think really helpful just to have some of those statistics. And for those of you interested in some of the resources and information that we're referring to, those links will be shared in the chat by our partners from the ICD and the NACD who are co-hosting this session. All right, Marianne, so we've heard a little bit from both Joanne and Stephen. This is not necessarily a new dialogue as it relates to investor pressure and desire for more clear and transparent information on climate change impacts to a company. You're serving on the board of Algoma Steel. You're in a cross-listed company environment. Tell us, how are you preparing for this, and what did the journey entail? Where do you even start with this new complex topic?
That's a great question. So Algoma came out of a CCAA and then was part of a SPAC deal becoming public. And so again, with my lens, thinking about the heavy weight on management coming out of something like that. And then you've got a board member, it happened to be me because I had gone through the ICD and also your inaugural program on climate change. With the ICD, I started to raise issues about the task force for climate-related financial disclosure. And I think it's interesting. It's just like the first time somebody talks about cybersecurity, it's like that happens to them. It's not as relevant for us. I think people, even with with the term climate change, they sort of scoop it all up in ESG and think, this is something we can talk about, but I don't think there was a general understanding that this is a march. We're all starting this march together. Some are more advanced, so you've got some peers out there that are already doing ESG related reporting, but soon, we're, because of the Canadian Securities Administrators coming out first back in 2021, with what they said we're going to have to be doing, followed by the SEC and the Issb. You've now got a board that is highly focused on this. And what's interesting is this is, running alongside a very ESG friendly transformation that the company is also undertaking. So the company is going from blast furnace steel to electric arc furnace, which is a fantastic story. The company got $400 million from the Canadian government under very favorable terms. So you've got this great story happening on the climate side, but focusing management and the board to take on this huge project was a huge project in and of itself. And so, I think the first sort of reach out to us was from our auditors. They started to raise this as an audit risk coming into the future. All of the big four have groups that can certainly assist in this transformation. As you know, Sarah, I brought your group, ESG Global, to the table, and we decided to retain you as our partner in doing this journey together. In our circumstance, this became part of the nominating and governance committee's role to take on ESG. But I think, as we will talk about later, when you're talking about climate related risks and opportunities, it's really difficult to think of one board committee that encapsulates all of that. It's definitely in the audit side. If you have a separate risk committee, it's part of that. It's part of your compensation committee. Are you going to be compensating and driving these types of values and behaviors in your people? So, I think we're 6 months into the journey, and we still have 6 to 8 months to go. But for those on the phone that are just starting this journey or thinking about, what will that entail? I think the good news is peer benchmarking as your first step is a great first step. We're not all, reinventing the wheel here. And there are others, in our industries that are doing this, and some of them are doing it quite well. And so part of the process starts with taking a look at those peer groups. What types of ESG reports do they have out there? And also, you look at your own internal risk register to see what is the company currently looking at in terms of material risks on a climate related side, and working together with your partner, as we do with you at ESG Global, trying to identify those. And then the first round of all of that information then gets brought from management to the board, and the board takes a look at it and challenges it, as the board does in its strategic oversight. Are we looking at all of the things that we think will have a materially financial impact that are climate related? And then you move through to the next process, which we haven't gotten to yet, where this forms part of your strategy and ultimately your first report. Ours will be an ESG report, obviously, and then there will be compliance with these new rules once they become enacted. So what I would say is it's a huge undertaking, and I think most companies need help in doing this. Very rare, I would say, that you're going to have somebody sitting on the board that has this experience. And that raises questions. Do you need someone on the board that needs that kind of experience? Or can you have a program of education with your board members so that they have enough knowledge to be able to do their job and challenge and question and provide the oversight that's necessary in terms of developing this? But it is time consuming, costly, and it does take existing management away from their day-to-day core business, which is, operating usually and getting product out for our business. And so we needed to beef up our management team. And also we did add a couple of individuals to our board. And we were looking specifically for somebody in this area, but couldn't find them, to be honest with you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Marianne. And thanks, Joanne, for joining us.
Bye,
Point, I think, what's quite interesting, you've given a couple of practical steps with respect to where to get started, doing that assessment, benchmarking relative to peers, evaluating what's already captured in the risk register, and using that as the foundation for the development of a thoughtful strategy. And what I like about this is that it kind of underscores something that I think we all want corporate directors to realize, is that, and there is a question here from the audience, and would love reaction from both of you. Is it the regulation that's really driving the change here, or is there something bigger? And I always say, don't let that reporting tail wag that strategy dog, right? And so that the process you've just outlined, Marianne, is really about, I think, connecting climate risk and opportunity back to what the core business is at Algoma, for example. And so I would love just reaction in terms of what's gonna get corporate directors' attention the most when it comes to this issue of climate change, if not this new disclosure regulation, or is it the regulation that's really driving the conversation? Maybe I'll go to Stephen and then Marianne.
I think it's a virtual cycle in the sense that investors have been asking for this for literally decades, and it's showing up. So there are individual investor engagements with companies, there are shareholder resolutions, and if you look at the statistics just in the US, and we've done separate reports on these too, they're on our website, the number of shareholder resolutions have gone up on climate issues. The number of company settlements have gone up on those issues. The number of expenditures companies are making. The other thing is I just want to spend a minute on is the opportunity. I mean, just in the last few months in the US, the Inflation Reduction Act was passed, and with over $600 billion of direct expenditures, that's going to leverage hundreds of billions more, but then there's lots of other ways in terms of incentives and things like that. So if you're a company, one of the questions is, how will this affect me? Or how will it affect my supply chain? Am I selling a widget or a product that's going to a company that's, whether it's going to be as direct as a solar or EV, or am I selling pipes to fossil fuels, and that's going to be on a declining basis? So there's an enormous opportunity here. That's going to generate interest from boards. If boards are always looking at what are the growth opportunities, investors are demanding this, and that's growing in the last few years. That's going to continue to grow. Customers are asking for it. Employees, we're all in this virtual world. Employee retention is critical. 74% of employees from a recent survey show they want to work in a place that shares their values. So if a company is leading on these issues, it helps them from an employee retention perspective. There are great PR opportunities if they're serious, not greenwashing, but serious about it. And the regulations make a difference. So will regulations have an impact? Absolutely. We're all driven by what the government tells us to do in our respective lines of work, but regulations are also responding to what the market is saying. And the market is saying, again, it varies by country and by sector, but overall, there is greater interest. So it is a virtual cycle. And as there are more regulations, that'll generate more leadership with companies. And there are also great companies in every sector. In every sector, there are great examples of companies that are doing an amazing job in this area, and that's generating goodwill for them. So yes, it's regulations, but it's a virtual cycle.
Thanks, Stephen. I think that's quite helpful, and we're going to come back to you shortly for some examples of those companies doing this well. Marianne.
Yeah, I would agree with what Stephen said. I think, when I look at Algoma Steel, though, for example, we had the good story. It's more about communicating it effectively and in a comparable fashion. So we were reducing our emissions by 70% by this transformation to electric arc furnace. So the story was good. We were doing all of the right things. We were looking into the future for the sustainability of the company. And we got down that path without the regulations being there. I think the thing that the regulations bring, though, and the reporting requirements will bring a level of consistency, transparency, and comparability to our peers. So different people in our peer group are doing different things. This is one way to make sure that the message is comparable, I guess I would say. So, it's interesting because for some, the regulations may be more difficult because their story is not a good story. So if you're reporting and your story is not necessarily a good story, and your numbers are not looking good, then that's a different story to tell. But if you are able to show a good story, and fundamentally, back to Stephen's comment, there can't be any greenwashing here. If you're looking to 2050, what are the real steps that you're taking 3, 5, 10 years out? And I think that level of discipline actually doesn't just help us, in the capital markets, it helps us internally as a company, because we're seeing things more quickly because they are now more readily connected into our internal KPIs. So we're able to evaluate our progress in a more immediate fashion and a consistent fashion.
Thanks, Marianne. And I think, it's interesting because Stephen has underscored the opportunity side of things a number of times. And I think to your point, I often work with clients who have undertaken these initiatives for a variety of strategic reasons. And now they actually see this new regulation as an opportunity to more meaningfully and clearly tell that story of how it connects to the business. And I know that both of you have mentioned some of the global developments in this regard, and just want to take a moment to touch on the development of the International Sustainability Standards Board, or the Issb, as our panelists have mentioned. Similar to what we've seen from a regulatory perspective here in Canada and the US, we're also seeing movement on a global scale with respect to developing accounting standards for the reporting of ESG topics, with the first area of focus being climate-related financial disclosure. And so for those of you who may be newer to this topic, take a look at the ISSB's new proposed disclosure standards that can be used by organizations globally. These are now out for consultation. They received an overwhelming amount of attention, similar to the proposals in Canada and the US from the CSA and the SEC. And ultimately, what we're starting to see is a coalescence around the Tcfd framework. And certainly I can speak to many corporate directors that I work with are quite pleased with these developments, because they've been navigating, as Marianne has noted, a bit of an alphabet soup of different reporting frameworks. Even when they try to benchmark relative to peers, can't always get that apples to apples comparison. So I wonder, Stephen, if it might be a good time to get an example of a company or two who's doing this well, particularly in some of those more challenging areas that we've seen in the proposals that have gotten some more of that intense feedback, perhaps Scope 3 emissions, or even linking achievement of climate targets to executive compensation. Who's doing it well, and what does that look like today?
So there are literally hundreds. First is 92%, I think, as I said earlier, of Fortune 500 companies have some kind of climate disclosure. Now, they vary on depth and requirement. I don't want to say that all 92% are doing it well. And there is, as you said, there's both the disclosure and then there's taking steps to reduce it. So some of the technology companies, Microsoft, Apple, for example, they have set bold goals to be carbon neutral, depending on the company, by 2035, 2040, 2045. They disclose scopes 1, scope 2, and scope 3. And they have, I don't want to say more importantly, but it's very important, taking additional steps to reduce those. For us, what is critical is, while 2050 is great, 2030 is what's important. That the reality is the average CEO is there, I think it's 6 or 7 years for Fortune 500 companies. So for CEO to set a 2050 goal, it's an aspiration, but they're not going to be responsible for it. Setting a 2030 goal is much more meaningful. So that companies that have set science-based, public, measurable goals, and with TCFD reports or other analysis, CDP, there's a whole variety of ways to do it, and used a consistent methodology, published it, at least on their website, if not filed it, is critical. And there are, again, literally hundreds of companies that have done that. If you look at what CDP has, SASB, TCFD filings, there are great examples in almost every sector. I mean, and this is not just easy sectors. I mean, there are cement companies, there are steel companies, there are fossil fuel companies that are the parts companies, automobile companies that have done a great job. I mean, just the major automobile companies as examples, where most of them, not all, but they've set a 2035 to have transitioned to electric vehicles. That it translates into a tens, or in some cases even larger, tens of billions of dollars of capital investment. It also will obviously change their employee mix and the training. So that is not just setting a goal, but there's year by year measurements of how they're doing on some of those things. Is that driven because of climate? Is it driven because of customers? Is it driven because of employees? It's, again, that confluence I talked about earlier. So we appreciate that work. But the problem is, while there are hundreds of companies that we could literally spend the rest of this time talking about and with great appreciation, there are thousands or tens of thousands that aren't yet there. And, you know, we, the world, need to reduce emissions by roughly half by 2030. And the world's only going to do that, US is only going to do that, Canada's only going to do that if the major companies are doing it as well. And so we need everybody to be doing this, to look for and to look for those big opportunities that they can grow in those areas, because we also need trillions of dollars of investment. The UN has projected somewhere in the order of $5 to $6 trillion a year in new capital investment in solar and wind and EVs and carbon capture and new technologies. So there are lots of companies, but it's a small percentage of what we need to see on the playing field.
Thanks, Stephen. And, you know, I think a couple of points just to underscore there is with respect to the opportunity this presents. We are starting to see some very large companies doubling down on these net zero ambitions. And I think one of the key takeaways for this audience particular, I think, is that this is no longer an issue of the future, right? And I think that many folks have set the net zero by 2050 targets. And now this is where we see the pressure coming on. And it's underscored by some of the components of these proposals from the regulators saying, if you have set a target, we expect you now to report against progress toward that target. And in the case of the SEC, they're also asking for more detail on your transition plans. And so we can start to see that's where the rubber hits the road with respect to capital allocation, allocation of resources, diversification of workforce, investments in R&D and innovation. These are a lot of the conversations that are happening at that boardroom table of more of these sophisticated organizations who are well down the path. For those listeners who might be interested in taking a look at some of the best practices, I always point folks to the annual Tcfd status report. It will give you a great example of cross-sector disclosures covering governance, risk, strategy, and metrics and targets. So you can get a sense of what the current best practice looks like in this evolving area. And so reminder, please do feel free to use the Q&A function. We have about 17 minutes left in our discussion. I have plenty of questions, but one of them that's come up from the audience was one I also had on my list. And I'm going to start with Marianne on this one, which is, you know, your comment about not being able to find the correct expertise felt a bit daunting for our audience. So I get asked all the time, how would I know a climate competent director if I saw one? What's the skill set? What's a practical starting point for folks who may be listening to this and saying, you know, maybe this is a differentiator for me to serve on boards. Maybe I can add some value in this area. What should I be doing to get started?
It's a great question. And again, I often think of it, you know, as against cybersecurity. You know, these are two highly specialized areas, and how do board members become competent and conversant and fluent in the language of it and understand the process so that they can provide the right oversight to the management team. You know, I point people in the direction of the ICD. You know, going through the DEP diploma program was my first exposure to the task force for climate-related financial disclosure. It was covered in detail, and all it did for me was it was one of these areas where you've never been exposed to it before, so now you've got a thirst for knowing more. So then I did the climate course as well. I think it's all about education. You have to continue as a board member. You come to the board with your education that's probably 30 years ago, where you went to university, what your degrees were in. Then you've got your work experience. Then you've got your board experience. And then you've got issues that are constantly changing and evolving. You know, what's happening now on the climate front is one of them. 15 years ago, we were still looking at environmental issues. I was still, you know, when I was CEO of an automotive company, I was still, you know, including climate into strategy. We had plants that were located in tornado zones. So, but it was very sort of piecemeal, wasn't all put together. I think anyone who wants to become more educated in this area, there are so many tools, and I know that a lot of them are going to be posted. There are so many organizations, the organizations that are putting on this global conference, for example, that have materials out there that people can read and then go to the next level, go deeper. And in terms of, you know, when we were looking to expand our board, boards do a matrix where there's a list of different types of knowledge and experience that you have. And then you can see where the gaps are on the governance side. And, you know, can you retain somebody that has that exposure? I would say in this regard, unless somebody is doing it as their full-time occupation, so somebody, you know, such as yourself on ESG Global, or people coming or retiring out of an accounting firm that has sort of helped people transition, you're really just looking at people that are doing what I did over the last 2 years, which is just continually try to educate myself, because this is critically important to our company. It's critically important to everyone. It's important to the world. It's important to the environment, but it is critically important to companies as well. And particularly our company that is on this transformational journey. So we need to be able to not just execute on what we're doing, but we need to be able to communicate it properly, report on it properly. And there is a lot of information out there. I mean, that's the good thing. We're all going through this at the same time. There is a lot of information out there. So I wouldn't shy away from it. For the person that put the question in there, I dig in with 2 shovels.
Thanks, Marianne. And I think just to underscore that point is, you know, if it is a fiduciary duty, if it is aligned with oversight of, you know, strategy and risk, it is imperative that at least all members of the board have a baseline understanding to be able to effectively oversee these issues. Stephen, so let's fast forward to a world where folks have that baseline understanding and now they're trying to figure out how to organize themselves. I get asked this question a lot. You know, what's the best practice? How should we organize ourselves? Marianne touched on this a little bit in some of her opening remarks. Would love to turn to you for some practical tips here.
Sure. So first, let me answer how to organize ourselves both at the company level and at the board level. So first, at the board level, there is no, we have a lot of publications on our website, series.org. Feel free to look at it. But the short answer is there's no one answer that fits for everyone. The journalist, H.L. Mencken, an author, once said, you know, for every complex problem, there's a simple answer that's always wrong. And there's a lot how companies set up, how many committees they have, who are the people on that. But as a general rule, climate affects every element of work. So we've seen more and more companies build it into every company, every committee they have. So it affects their audit work. It affects their financial planning. It affects HR. It affects procurement. It affects other things, their strategic planning, if they have a nominations and governance committee, et cetera. So there are many that are doing that. Depending on their industry, some will also have a special committee dealing with climate issues because it's so core to their work. So, but there has to be, what is clear for everybody is everyone has to understand who it is. So when there's a climate issue, and you can't have, quote, just a climate director, oh, I'm going to ask that person, because then you're delegating it in that way and you're really not taking ownership. So there has to be a clear line of authority. It has to be in the charter of the committees. So it's part of their responsibility. Each committee, they have to get regular reports from management in whatever system they have on many other key issues, so that it's built in. It has to be built into the strategic planning and the budgeting process. So that's kind of across the board. The other issue, as we briefly touched on before, there is a growing number, it's still a minority, but a growing number of companies that have built this into their executive compensation. So, and again, there are several studies on this. We have some on our website, and there are others, that climate is a long tail issue. While there could be a hurricane, as US just faced, or other issues, to plan for it may take 3, 5, 10, 15 years. And so how to build it into a long-term compensation. So there's a lot of issues there, but we think that that's an important element. And then the company, as I say, needs to have a climate leader, somebody who is assigned, depending on the size of the company, it may be their full-time job or it may be part of another set of responsibilities. And then there needs to be a cross-discipline senior committee, because again, whether that person sits in the audit department or in the legal department or the marketing or procurement or whatever it may be, those are all important, but not siloed. So there has to be some regular basis, like a monthly meeting across board, and then bringing in outside folks like you guys for consulting, depending on the size of the company and their expertise. So a committee structure at the board built into reporting, address the CEO and senior managers, and then have a senior person who reports to the board or reports to the CEO who reports to the board, but then a committee at the areas, including at the regulatory areas. For example, we're publishing a report in less than a month that shows that companies that say, of the top 100 S&P, who say they are climate aligned, the overwhelming number of them, their lobbying is not climate aligned. That they join trade associations, they lobby for positions that are different from what they're saying. And so that's an example where their lobbying and public affairs team has to be part of this mix. Back to you.
Sarah, if I can just quickly comment. I know a lot of people that are hearing this probably are saying, oh, like, I wish it was one committee, because it can be so simple, but I completely agree with Stephen. I think the only thing that I'll say at Algoma, the one committee, the governance committee, is the one sort of spearheading the hiring of the consulting group and the starting of the process. And we're working together with our finance team at the company. But all of the other committees come to our meeting to take a look at what the report is saying, because you have to, because it affects everything. And I know a lot of people listening will say, well, doesn't that sort of create an opportunity for a lack of accountability somewhere, because things will slip through the cracks because somebody else is responsible? I'd say you really have no choice here, because it really does critically impact and is a part of all of the different committee mandates. So the only way to ensure it's not slipping through the cracks, at least what we're doing, is then the governance committee pulls everybody in, and then we take a look at everything, and then we separate back out into our groups. But it really does affect everything.
Yeah, and I think that excellent comments, both Marianne and Stephen, on this one. So no one size fits all. Important to distinguish between role of board and how they organize themselves with their committees, and the role of management and ultimately their cross-functional committees. And you know, one of the topics that I want to just underscore, and a reoccurring theme here, is while this conversation is focused on regulation, as I said, it's just the hook. It's really just defining what companies now must consistently provide so that investors have that comparable information to allocate capital. But so much of this conversation is really focused on the substance of what is included in that disclosure. And I just wanted to kind of acknowledge that the comments that have been made here by both Stephen and Marianne are almost to a T the type of qualitative disclosure that you see under the TCFD framework for governance, right? And both the SEC and the CSA proposals have mandatory disclosure related to governance and integration into risk management. So this really does help folks just to get their head around the content that ends up finding its way into those sections of reporting and disclosure. We've got about 5 minutes left, and we have a really good question from the audience. So I'm going to touch on that one, and then I'm going to ask you both for wrap-up remarks. And that is, how far will these proposals go to address the issue of greenwashing that we are increasingly seeing in the capital markets? You know, a lot of both, you know, selective disclosure, maybe not so balanced disclosure in some of these voluntary reports. You know, maybe Stephen, I'll get you to just quickly define greenwashing for the audience, and then you can both provide a few thoughts on, do you think these proposals and the work being done by the Issb at the global level will help to address this growing issue?
So first, greenwashing is when a company or an investor or others have environmental claims that they can't back up in substance. and because they do it for marketing or other reasons. It could be nefarious, or it could just be sloppy. It's not all, you know, I would never question intent. Will these be helpful? Yes, they will, but the market will need to respond. I mean, in other words, what has happened in other areas, it's when the regulations are in place, but then consumers respond, trade associations, and then companies get better and they understand, and then they ultimately raise the bar. And there are hundreds of examples. Food safety is a recent one in the US, but there are other ones as well. So they will make a difference. It's important to note that there are two other rules the SEC is looking at dealing with greenwashing for investment funds. So what we're talking about is now greenwashing for companies, but there is what's called the fund name rule and an ESG disclosure that the SEC is also considering, so that if you put your money in the XYZ green fund, but it's really invested in fossil fuel, so that's also an important element to think about that. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Marianne?
Yeah, I was going to say that I think once these rules are actually launched and in play, so for example, in my industry, once we're all reporting under these rules, I think what ends up happening is sort of, to Stephen's point, if you are trying to just put in boilerplate statements, you're going to be called on by proxy advisors. They're going to talk about it because they're going to be able to compare apples to apples. We're going to be seeing it compared with our industry peers. And so you're going to be held to account. They're going to say, no, this is not deliberate. You're not showing us how you're getting to these goals that you're stating. And, you're going to have to do the work to get it right, because it will become transparent once the reporting, I think, is out there.
It'll definitely be, I think, an iterative process over time, as both of you have really emphasized there. Okay, so we have only about 2 minutes left. So what I'd like to do is just offer you both a chance to wrap up with your closing remarks. And so I'm going to pose it in this way for all of our participants here today who are listening to a number of sessions on their roles and responsibilities. We know that both of the regulators we've discussed, the SEC, the CSA, are aiming to finalize their proposed rules by the end of the year if all goes to plan. What should corporate directors be doing today to start preparing? I'll start with Marianne, I'll go to Stephen, and then I'll close up.
I think they have to do exactly what we're doing, which is if you don't have an ESG report out there yet, that's your first place to start. You're going to have to get that out there. You're going to have to do the hard work to make sure that you're capable of complying when these regulations come out. And I mean, I think the process itself is very revealing in terms of both risks and opportunities. And those things impact the long-term sustainability of the corporation. And so I think instead of looking at it as something that we just have to do, I think we need to try to embrace it and really throw ourselves into it. I know that's what we're doing, at my board. And I think we're going to be a better company for it when we come out at the other side.
Thanks, Marianne. And Stephen.
First, Sarah, thank you for the great questions and leadership, and Marianne for the thoughtful comments. Pleasure to be with both of you. And I completely agree. They have to look first internally. How is their board set up, their committees, the CEO, their reporting system? And don't get overwhelmed. Just figure out where you are and try to move forward. And then externally, understanding what your industry is doing, your competitors, what's happening with these draft regulations. So that, as I said earlier, to get ready both internally and externally. This is an enormous risk if they don't do it, but there's also an enormous opportunity for each of them to think about for their bottom line. Back to you with deep thanks.
Thank you so much, Stephen and Marianne, and to our other panelists for your contributions today. And I just want to thank all of you for attending today's panel. On behalf of the NACD, the U.S. Climate Initiative, as well as the Institute of Corporate Directors, Chapter 0 Canada, I want to extend a warm thank you for attending and your great questions, and we wish you all the best with your next session.
Thanks, Sarah.